Hello, and welcome back to another episode of International Immersion, a podcast where we bring together people, ideas, cultures, experiences, and put them into a place where we can learn about and explore this amazing world of ours. So it's glad to be back for another episode, as it's been a while since a lot of things have been going on lately, and it's been difficult to put episodes together. But for today's episode, I have my father back, and we're going to discuss another additional topic from his business experiences that we previously covered. And tonight's topic, we're going to talk about his interactions with other foreign business people in the Far East. So, Dad, it's great to have you back today.
Yeah, thank you. Glad to be back.
Yeah, so I thought it'd be interesting after discussing with you recently. You brought up a good point about what it was like to work with or interact with other foreign business people while you were in the Far East, because we've discussed what it's like to deal with the locals, but it must have been also interesting dealing with other foreign nationals from different business backgrounds.
Yeah, it was actually, it was quite enjoyable on a lot of levels because, you know, when you're in a foreign country, you know, like the Far East, whether it's Taiwan, China, Indonesia, you know, Korea and other places. It's good to see kind of a familiar face. Most Americans come from either Britain or Europe, you know, or Scandinavian countries, and we all kind of look the same. So, you know, there's a certain familiarity and a certain, I guess, comfort level in that when you run into other business people, either in hotels, restaurants, you know, or in the general environment, kind of gives you a connection, you know, to the experience, you know, of just, hey, that person, I can actually talk to this person in a way that I would kind of back in the States.
Oh, I see, and I can completely relate. It was like that when I was overseas as well. I mean, it's not like you need that, but it's like, oh, a familiar face. It is kind of a feeling of a little more of a, it's just a little comforting and kind of a feeling of maybe something more familiar and being back home to an extent, you could say.
Yeah, and it's, you know, it gives you an opportunity to also be able to get perspectives, you know, from them, because the folks that you run into, of course, you run into people from the U.S., you run into people from Europe, the U.K., I mean, pretty much all over the world that come to do business, you know, manufacturing-wise in the Far East. So it's a great opportunity to get different, you know, world perspectives from people that aren't necessarily from the U.S.
Yeah, that actually leads us into our first big point for this evening, and that would be, what were some of the first impressions that you got from a lot of these business types or people from different countries that you interacted with?
Well, first and foremost, I think that, you know, from a level of familiarity, you know, running into people in the industry that I was in at that time, you know, footwear and import of footwear, you know, from the Far East to the U.S., you know, you run into competitors, people you've known in the business, and that's an opportunity to kind of say, hey, I've seen you at a trade show. Hey, I've seen you at this particular, you know, at Walmart in, you know, Fayetteville, Arkansas, or something like that. So it gives you kind of an immediate connection where then you can talk about what that person is doing or what their group is doing over there, how it relates to you, or how it may be different. So I think that's probably a good place to start.
See, no, that makes complete sense. So, I mean, so a lot of these first impressions would be just like, you know, seeing them, talking to them, more casual in nature, you could say.
Yeah, I think most of the encounters probably happened in the hotels. You know, the days were long. You're usually, you know, out in the morning early, you know, especially if you had to travel, you know, out to a particular factory or, you know, sample, you know, development facility, which was usually attached to a factory. But a lot of times the factories had, you know, relationships with other companies that weren't your own. So you run into these people there, and it was, you had the ability to be able to talk shop. Obviously, you know, being careful not to, you know, to give away any competitive information or anything like that you were doing, you know, at the time. But still, it was an opportunity then to say, hey, what hotel are you staying at? I'm staying at there. So, hey, let's, you know, get together for a cocktail or, if you didn't have dinner going on with one of the suppliers or factory people or whatever, or if you were staying at the same hotel. That's when I ran into, a lot of folks that were in the same industry as well as other industries. So I think first impression wise is it was just in the early years of going over there, it was great to be able to run into those folks because, as I said, it was a level of familiarity and you were able to kind of talk about, your impressions, whether they were kind of new to traveling over there or whether they've been traveling over there for a while. So it was a way to get kind of, tips, everything from kind of how you kind of navigate the environment, navigate the relationships, to, just general interactions. It gave you a sense that you were kind of, there was a little bit of home there, especially with the people who were from the U.S.
I see. That makes total sense. I mean, from my experiences, I've also met a decent number of, people from other countries, the U.S., while I've stayed in hotels overseas as well. And it is kind of a nice time, especially in that off time to kind of just mingle, chat, and you can learn a lot. And then you can learn a lot. They can also learn a lot while at the same time, especially if there's any competitiveness going on. You can, maintain your secrecy on whatever you need to do business wise. Yeah. But I do think that's a nice added bonus because you never know who you're going to run into when you're over there.
Absolutely. And then there's the folks that are from the UK or Europe or other parts of the country that come to do business there, either in the same field. I ran into people from Canada on some of my earlier trips that I had met going up to Canada for trade shows. So that was kind of interesting because it gave you an opportunity to be able to kind of see if there was anything that you could do together. Because it wasn't just people from my side of the business. It wasn't just, suppliers or, development houses, that were selling, or brokering product from the Far East to the U.S. There was also people who were buyers, because the buyers would take trips too to inspect factories and to, ensure that, their direct orders, things they had done exclusively internally, were in a position, that they could make sure everything was on schedule, that kind of thing. So it was an opportunity to be able to forge business relationships as well. Not so much on the UK or the Europe side, because really didn't do the company I was with, the companies that I was with, a few different companies, did business exclusively in the US and Canada. But there was a number of occasions where I ran into buyers from Canada that we already had relationships with. And the first company that I was with, Elan Polo, which is still around and still based in St. Louis. So that was an opportunity to kind of, add a little bit of spice to the sales process and, kind of see what they were doing, what they needed, and maybe even set up something back in the States. So that was a good experience, and you kind of really helped to build those relationships in that way from, the more Western side of the hemisphere. But the folks that I ran in first impression wise, from Europe and the UK in particular, there was a lot more social element. You'd meet them in the hotels, as I said, primarily. It was usually in the restaurant or in the bar usually, because people would go there because, they were outside of their normal routine. And it was an opportunity to be able to, sing karaoke or, listen to whatever band was there, if there was one. And it gave me an opportunity to kind of get people's impressions, of what they did, if it was different than what you did. Because a lot of the folks I ran into from Europe and UK in particular, some of them were in the shoe business, higher end. There was one particular gentleman I met in China at one particular hotel that I ran to him more than once. And it was an opportunity to kind of say, hey, how are you doing? How's business, of course? And then to kind of talk about, impressions, depending on the time, and I believe that particular example, that person was more in the mid to late 90s. And it was, I think, it was kind of more, it always kind of seemed to connect to, what's going on in the U.S., talking about politics, talking about the economy at that particular time, which I think in the 90s, it was a combination of Bill Clinton and then, George Bush as the president. So in the George Bush years in particular, there was a lot of questions, about what's going on in the United States and how that kind of would affect, folks that were quote in NATO, or the people that, that were allies, particularly the Brits. And the Brits were always a lot of fun too, because, they knew how to have a good time and blow off steam as well. talk about the, their experiences of being there. And I think that's what really helped me to kind of bridge in the early years, kind of people who had a little bit more experience in traveling in the Far East, and kind of gain some pointers and some tips and some just general interactivity, things to be aware of.
I see. Yeah, actually, and that's quite pretty interesting in how you were able to do that, and also just what you learned, what you discussed, and of course, it makes more sense to you. You were able to do more with the Americans, especially if they were in solar industries, but at the same time, the Europeans and were also quite interesting, and you got a lot out of interactions with them. And that actually kind of brings into the next topic is you kind of touched on is, the different interactions, especially the people you met once, but also these people that you met repetitively, and you built up a bit of rapport with them, you could say. Yeah,
there was, I think it was probably in the early 2000s, I think late 90s, early 2000s, when I was still working with Foot Tech, ran into a gentleman from the States who worked in the furniture industry. And he actually was there, at that point in time, I think a lot of the manufacturing overall was moving, from different places that it normally was in the States over, to China in particular. He actually had an apartment, in I think it was Dongguan City. And actually, I think if I remember correctly, I ran into him like 4 or 5 times. He was,
oh, wow.
He really liked his karaoke. And I think he actually had, an Asian girlfriend at the time. And I think the last time I saw him, they were getting kind of serious, because he was there for 6-8 month stints because of the manufacturing schedules from the furniture side. And, he had a car and a personal driver. So there was opportunities to kind of go out and on the town, so to speak, with somebody, who you could have a different kind of experience with, maybe similar to what you do in a social way back in the States, but in that unique environment. So you could
definitely say he definitely became much more immersed. You could say, he wasn't just there in business. He was really living there. He immersed himself, and he really got a good, solid foundation of what it was like there. And he, it sounded like he assimilated quite well.
Yeah, I think that he, not unlike your experience, I think that, he really connected to it, probably because it was the nature of his job. But I think after time, after a certain point, he connected with, the culture and, not just the business situation that he had, but he connected with it to the extent that he started developing friendships and even romantic relationships with, people that were actually citizens of China. So that was interesting to talk about those stories, and, how they kind of affected him. I'm not sure, I lost track of them after a while. We had, a couple of, interactions, just kind of saying, hey, how you doing, that kind of thing, after we kind of saw each other over there in China the last time. But it was good to be able to have, I guess, that kind of the stability that comes along with having someone who you can relate to in a different way, but in that unique environment.
It's very important to have people that would, that maybe they're not necessarily always there, but they're there. They're more of a consistency factor when you travel, and you can meet up with them, you can spend time with them, and it's kind of nice. It makes the experience better. And it could be other foreigners, it could be, people in the country you're going to. All of that adds more depth to your travels, and also I think it really opens up a lot of opportunities, as we've kind of delved into before.
Yeah, and there was times with him, and maybe I think 1 or 2 other people, we actually got, our liaisons involved in some of the social activities and things on the weekends. So there was an opportunity to be able to see and observe how other business people develop their relationships with, their partners, their Asian partners, whether Taiwanese or Chinese. So I can remember a couple of different times towards the end of my experience of going over there, where you had people who weren't in the same industry. They were still in manufacturing, but you also had, their Asian partners. And you end up going out to dinner and over to, someone's residence or whatever that weren't connected to what you actually did. So it expanded that. You got to see the similarities and differences between how these people interacted, how their particular business environment was either the same or different than your own. And it really gave me some insight into a lot of the stuff that I had developed and did, and kind of gave some credence and some validity to the ways in which those relationships develop. So that was really good to be able to observe and interact with.
That's I think all those things are important. And the more interactions you get and the more you do it, the more appreciation you build, and also the more knowledge you build up, especially kind of interaction. And, not just with you and the locals, but other business people, it really can build a much stronger relationship, but also I'd say just better experiences and build up more potential connections and avenues to get to know people.
Yeah, it's good that I think it's important that you mentioned connections too, because, some of the things that I ended up doing later on, even though they were connected with the folks that I had the most interactions with, it was, there was opportunities, whether they actually developed into any kind of, they didn't necessarily solidify into anything, but the networking, which is so important over there. And that is important over here too, but it's just stylized to the Asian process, kind of gave you a little bit more of an insight and connectiveness to how other people were leveraging that in similar or different ways.
Oh, and you definitely have a little more experience on that with the business side of things, but I definitely have seen that more on the education side of things, having both studied and gone there for work regarding educational related things. So I definitely can see it. It's just, it may manifest differently, but the process and kind of the goals are the same.
Yeah, there was another cool experience that it was in Taiwan at the Evergreen Hotel there in Taichung, which was one of the first. I think it was built, if I remember correctly, I think it was built probably in the early 90s, because I had switched from Elon Polo to Foot Tech when I moved down to Florida. And, Elon Polo had a little bit more of a budget concerns about travel expenses, where Foot Tech was a little bit more liberal. So I got to stay at that particular hotel, and it was considered, the premier place to stay. Evergreen, there's that shipping company, they have the airlines, they're a bigger Taiwanese company that has its fingers in a lot of different, pies in the business world there. But that particular hotel was brand new. It was quite nice. Stayed there a number of times in my Foot Tech days, from like 96 through, right around 2000. But ran into a gentleman from Germany, because you'd run into a lot of folks. A lot of the, businessmen would go down to the bar, and the Evergreen Hotel also had a cigar bar. So they had the regular bar, and they had an area where they had live music on the weekends, kind of their main lobby area, because a lot of the buildings over there, especially in Hong Kong, but also imitated or, recreated in Taiwan and some of the other countries, where you'd have like the first, several floors were like, they were like shops, clothing shops, perfume shops, things like that. And then they would have like offices. And then I think it was like the 12th floor or so in the Evergreen Hotel, where it was actually the hotel lobby. And, they had a restaurant, a couple restaurants there. And then they had the, kind of bar area and the cigar bar, which was pretty nice, because they spent a lot of money in making that place look very much like, a high class kind of
for sure
place where business people. It was like a business club type thing, and they had a huge humidor with, all these, Cuban cigars, which you couldn't get, in the United
Oh, wow.
States in the same way. So I ran into a gentleman from Germany who was, I think he was, if I remember correctly, it was a while ago, so my memory might not be 100%, but I'm pretty sure that he was somehow involved in, with the automobile industry in Germany. And Taiwan was unique because they had all the major brand labels there, but they were very limited because of not only the size of, the island of Taiwan, but also the tariffs were really high. So I don't remember exactly if he was involved, with BMW or Mercedes-Benz or Porsche or something like that, but ended up getting in a really cool conversation with him about cars. And you remember, my childhood friend, Pete Reuter,
Yes.
kind of gave me a little bit of an introductory kind of element over the course that, we were hanging out together about, cars. So I kind of had a little bit of a leg to stand on. We were talking about, different lines of Porsche cars, that weren't around anymore. I think for some reason it comes about the 930 comes into my mind. And we had a, interesting discussion about, his industry and what he was there for. Again, if my memory serves me correctly, he was somehow, involved in, maybe more of the negotiation of tariffs and how, automobiles from, Germany in particular would come in, because it was a pretty selective market, and really only applied to people who were able to purchase automobiles from, high-end automobiles from Germany that, had the ability financially to do so. So that was an encounter that I remember, I even though we both were, I think we drank a lot that night, but it was still very memorable in terms of experience. And kind of just talked about, what he did when he was down there. And again, I don't have a real clear memory of exactly what it was, but
I'm
that's
sure it actually maybe helped you a lot because of it, as I remember, you eventually moved more into the car industry and started doing business with cars.
We started doing that with some folks that I was connected to in the shoe industry. Yeah. Unfortunately, the market kind of turned, and it didn't really last that long. It could have been quite lucrative, but it was more at the middle tier. It wasn't the kind of brand name cars. So that particular part of the market, was affected a lot by, how those companies would lobby, the Taiwanese government, in terms of tariffs. And it just kind of became really not viable anymore, unfortunately. But it was still a good experience. But that was quite prior to when that happened. I mean, that was probably a decade before kind of tried my hand at that.
Yeah, but I could see how it kind of maybe gave you some ideas or potential things that you could have used later on if they were just fleeting. It were just some potential, some embers, you could say.
Yeah, I think that was maybe a foreshadowing more so than anything else, but it was still interesting. And then there was a British gentleman that I ran into a couple times in China, and I don't remember what industry he was in, but he was very interested in talking about politics. Kind of alluded to it earlier, but those questions were interesting, set aside from any the business type of discussions that were had. It was more so, well, what's going on in your country? What's going on in your country? So we've talked about this before, getting perspectives from people, from Europe or the UK or whatever, in that environment kind of lends itself to maybe a little bit more of an openness, a little bit more of a kind of a direct communication about, what your personal feelings, whether conservative or liberal, whatever it would be. And then someone else's perspective who doesn't live there, but has, unique and interesting questions about why things are happening in a particular way. So it was, it was also expanding.
I think you bring up a really good point there in that when you meet people from other countries and you do, wander into the realm of politics and, what's going on in your country versus what's going on in mine, I think it's really interesting because you may get experiences and I would say different perspectives and ideas on what people from different countries think that you may not get from other people in your home country. Like, if you meet other Americans here, but you meet people from China, Europe, you're not going to get potentially the same points of view on the thing, on any issue you're discussing. And I think that's important because you won't get that unless you meet those people. And, there might be a lot of things shared, but I found from my own experiences that there's a lot of things that we think about, how the way we think about it is not how they think about it. And I think it's important that you have to get a sense of that, and it really makes you think, like, oh, I never thought about this issue in that way, or vice versa. If they want your opinion about maybe their situation, you could think of it, and they may think, oh, I never thought about that way either. So I think that's a very important thing. And as long as you don't get too heated or too emotional about it, which unfortunately a lot of people do, especially these days, from my own experiences, I think that's very useful, and it can really give you a lot of good insight. And also, I think it helps you become a better communicator.
Yes, I agree. I think that's the real root of that whole element. And it even becomes more interesting if you have some of your, Asian associates or partners involved in those conversations too, because they can, then they can put their own spin on that, as well as kind of, well, in Taiwan, this is kind of how it goes down. And there's the famous kind of YouTube videos that you can pull up, of the Taiwan parliament, beating each other up, and what's that all about? We don't see that necessarily in the U.S. or other parts of the world, but so what's that all about? That kind of thing. So
yeah, I have seen that video online. It's pretty crazy.
Well, I remember the first time I saw it on just local TV, and I was like taken aback for a moment. It was like cause for a pause. I was like, are they actually hitting each other? But yeah, they were. They passions are run high, and they wouldn't hold back, which is interesting because in a lot of ways over there, they tend to be a little more reserved. But I guess when it comes to certain things, politics being one, they don't hold back.
No, I think a lot of places sometimes, as with anything, politics, depending on people's constitution, it really affects them in different ways, and especially, and tensions run high and things can happen.
Yeah, but it's a totally different manifestation of that in Asia, at least in Taiwan, that I've seen anywhere else I've been in the world, and especially in the United States. I mean, people can yell at each other and accuse each other of things like that, but they don't come to blows usually. At least I can't remember a recent situation that's in the government, not necessarily outside the government.
True, very true. Yeah, important to clarify that. Yeah, and I think you really touched on this, and kind of going into our third point. It's how this has affected business outcomes, and you kind of already demonstrated that it gave you a lot of insight, perspective, and new ideas on things. But would you say there were any specific business deals or any outcomes that were in large part because of them, or not so much?
I would say business deals wise, not so much, except for some of the examples that I mentioned earlier in the podcast, where there were people that were actually buyers. They weren't part of a company like I was a part of. And that lended itself to things that ended up happening a little bit differently back, in North America. But I guess, and again, you touched on it before, I think that the real benefit of that was, perspectives and the ability to communicate across different perspectives that then helped me increase the skill set of my ability to communicate with a larger variety of people, not just necessarily from the standpoint of Asian or American or European, or British or whatnot. It was more being able to bridge those communication gaps or come up with an opportunity to have a conversation that I wouldn't necessarily be able to have if I hadn't had those experiences. Does that make sense?
Oh, no, completely agree with you. And I think that in many cases, you could even go to say that when you do travel overseas to a certain country, you meet the locals there, but in many cases, you can get a bit of a microcosm of different people from around the world, because other business people there or just people traveling, you can meet them and you get a sense of people's perspectives from who knows how many countries.
Yeah, and if they do something similar in their communication, do they recognize the same, qualities and attributes that work from a communication perspective? Do they do things differently? And I think that for myself, that's kind of what I gained a lot out of those interactions, however social, they were mostly social, was the ability to be able to see things from a different perspective, but also to see the similarities, that I was kind of on the right track towards, a greater communication across the board.
No, and that makes total sense, and I completely agree with you on that. And I think the more people from more countries you interact with, build relationships with, etc., the better communicator you're going to be, and the more able you are going to be to understand people and think from their point of view. Not necessarily, agree with it, but understand and think from their point of view, which a lot of people, I think, it's not that they can't do it, they haven't had the opportunity to explore that.
That's right. And you talk about understanding, and understanding is a really critical part of that process, because it gives you, again, the perspectives that we talked about, but it also gives you the ability to be able to kind of transcend, some of the things that, as you said before, didn't really get a chance to be able to, to consider.
Exactly. No, and I completely agree. And I just wish more people would have the opportunity to do that, and and be able to expand upon that, because it's just sad when you see a lot of people that they make assumptions about things, or they go places it's just kind of, it's sad. And it's also like they could really expand themselves, but do they give themselves the opportunity? Now, not saying everyone has the opportunity. A lot of people just don't have the opportunity, or they're in a profession or situation where they can't do that. But those who do, it's my hope that they would do their best to, have an open mind, learn from everyone they met, and not stick to their thoughts, beliefs, and values, too strictly. I mean, we have to abide by them, but at the same time, allow for a little understanding and, cause for contemplation, or, what's a good word, recollection about potentially what you can learn and how you can learn new things, and apply that to yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it creates a greater level of connection and the ability to be able to kind of bridge stuff. If you have a familiarity with a particular perspective from Europe, even though similar to the U.S., it again adds to that. And this is something that's kind of been a theme through a lot of different podcasts that we've done, is the expansion of your ability to be able to think across different cultural barriers or boundaries, or recognize more specifically that those boundaries aren't really what you thought they were before.
Oh, no, completely true. And I think it's important that we keep exploring that, and we keep bringing that to people's attention, that is something that anyone can do. And if they have the opportunity, they should do it, and they can really get a lot of benefit from that, and not just from themselves, but for others.
Yeah, it also it creates your personality as an example of how that's done. So even those who haven't had an opportunity to have those experiences and do those things, they can then inquire, how are you such a good communicator? How did you come to this particular point? And that gives you an opportunity to, by your example and your explanations to them, and your ability to get them to understand, how you got there. That then really lends itself to kind of a broader perspective and ability to be able to communicate in general.
No, for sure. And with that kind of brings us to our last point for this episode, and that would be what would you say would be some of your lasting impressions that you've taken away from these other foreign business types that you've met while overseas in the Far East?
Well, I think the first thing is that they were engaged in the same type of process that I was, to a greater or lesser extent. They had business responsibilities, things that they need to do over their objectives, but they were also struggling, being challenged by, and overcoming the ability to be able to work in that environment effectively. So that was the first thing. The second thing, that, to a greater or lesser extent, they were interested or became interested in the culture and how it was different or similar, to their own. So they were bridging those gaps internally and personally. And I think the last thing was that, and again, this is a trend we've talked about in a lot of these podcasts, was that when you get immersed to whatever extent in that environment, you yourself become a different person, or at least more of your natural self is able to come out in a way that kind of transcends those cultural, or ethnic or whatever it be boundaries, and the world becomes a larger, but at the same time, a more understandable place.
Exactly. At the end of the day, we're all humans, and we all want this. We all strive for very similar things, if not the same things, depending on your perspective.
Yeah, so I would say those are probably the biggest thing that I recognized or observed in the interaction with people that weren't native to those Asian countries.
I see. Well, then that's great perspective, Dad. And I think that, anything we do or places we go, we always get impressions from it. But from this experience, since, this was kind of a phase in your life, for nearly 20 years, it really did give you a lot of opportunity to meet people and come away with a lot of good knowledge, information that you're able to use now in your current business situation and career. But
yeah, it definitely expanded my skill set, my ability to be able to apply that, to pretty much any situation or business or job related thing that I would have.
No, for sure. Well, and would you say there would be anything else you came away with, or were those pretty much kind of the main points? Would you say?
I would say those are the main points. Those were the most important things. I mean, obviously, it was great to be able to run into people from different countries that weren't Asian. And that experience in of itself, mostly from a social level, was, very fulfilling, and, had the aspects of it that gave you the flavor of where they were from and why they were there. But no, those three things were the primary things I took away from it.
Well, that's awesome, Dad, and I'm really glad that you were able to kind of encapsulate a lot of these ideas into our discussion this evening. So, Dad, I really appreciate you being on again. It's always insightful talking to you about these experiences, and I hope that everyone who listened today gets a lot of good insight and expertise from what you discussed, primarily with, what it's like to meet other foreign business types while you're overseas in a certain country, and it kind of adds an additional layer of complexity and interest in whatever you're doing, regardless of the industry you're doing. So, Dad, I just wanted to say thanks again for being on tonight. It's always a pleasure to have you. For everyone who listened, if you guys have thoughts, suggestions, comments, feel free to leave us a comment at International Immersion at podcast@gmail.com, and we'll gladly take any ideas or suggestions into consideration for future content. And this has been another episode of International Immersion. Everyone who's dealing with COVID right now, please stay safe, take care of yourself. We'll get through this pandemic and back to traveling and exploring this great world of ours. And we'll see you on the next one.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. Appreciate the time. Appreciate the opportunity.
Same here, Dad.